This program was created with the love and support of all our Patreon members and subscribers. If you are not a member yet and would like to see more content like this, consider becoming a member today. The link is in the description of this video. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother Asarimhotep from the Martin Delaney Center for Egyptology. And we have a very, very special guest with us, Dr. John Paulas, who is an expert in Greek philosophy and literature. And we are going to tackle a particular excerpt from Plutarch, which has been very kind of central and instrumental to an ongoing argument that we've been having in the Egyptological circle regarding the reference to Kemet and its possible link to a concept of the pupil of the eye. And so we're going to delve into the literature of the time, a proper and more nuanced way on how to interpret the literature of this time. And we have our expert with us today. And so all that and more when we return in just a moment. And we are back. And I just want to welcome each and every one of you for joining us today. And a shout out to everyone on our Patreon. Your continued support allows for us to have these dynamic discussions. And it is because of y'all that in many respects, this interview is even possible. Because the Patreon is for the Chiana Into documentary film that we are in the process in the beginning stages of shooting. And I happen to interview a particular person who happens to be the wife of our esteemed guest today for that documentary film. And just talking to him prior to the interview, discovered that he got his PhD dealing with ancient Greek literature and philosophy and the like. And I asked him a question about a particular issue, which many of you may be already familiar with, because, of course, you have a copy of Race and Identity in Ancient Egypt, Volume 1, towards an etymology of the place named Kemet. And in this text, I address a particular passage coming from Plutarch's of Isis and Osiris, or on Isis and Osiris. And this particular passage has been used by a lot of researchers concerning the true meaning and the etymology of the place named Kemet. And when I examined the text for myself, I came to a different conclusion than the vast majority of scholars on that particular subject. And I am, not very knowledgeable in Greek language and history and culture. So I consulted a number of scholars who are experts in that area and got a lot of positive feedback as well as some differing views, and which are in the text itself. And so I just want to get some, an expanded opinion. and just so happened to come across our guest today, Dr. John Paulas, and he has provided some insight, on the passage, and we are going to go in depth and discuss it here today. So I want to welcome you to the Mbongi, and thank you for coming, and thank you for allowing me to interview you here today.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here with you today, and greetings to everyone out there listening. So glad you could hear us.
Indeed. Given that this is your first time on this platform, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and how did you get into Greek literature and the like? And I know you've kind of pivoted from that life into something
Right.
different, so maybe you can give us a little insight into that as well.
Sure. Well, I got into Greek literature really kind of in a interesting way. My love of literature started with actually Spanish literature, especially
Mhm.
the literature of South America, and authors like Borges, and the kind of learned and kind of scholarly writing of authors like Borges really made me think, oh, I really need to go back in time and figure out the stuff that they knew about, from antiquity. From especially, I was drawn to Greek antiquity, and so I started studying Greek in college as an undergrad, and I really got drawn in there for a long time, and it really became a formative part of my um, development as an adult, as just as a person. So even though on a daily basis, I don't deal with Greek literature anymore on a daily basis in my life. I do. It's such a part of me that I use it. I actually use it in my current work. Actually, there's so the just to let the audience know, I have a daily podcast called Life's Potluck Buffet. That's for personal and professional development, and it's based around a set of cards that I created called Life's Potluck Buffet. And the card deck has 55 cards. I know some of your audience will know about it. And the one of the cards is actually based on a story from Plutarch, and it's
Mm.
about his discussion with five. It's a kind of dialogue of five people talking about why there's this mysterious letter E in one of the temples in Delphi, the ancient Greek city of Delphi, which is a beautiful city. But so it's kind of interesting how, thinking about the thread that runs through my life and career and scholarly life, intellectual life, the ancient Greek, especially the ancient Greek of this period that we're talking about today, plays a formative role and a central role. So it's always with me, and that's a fact of my life.
Excellent, excellent. And so the can you just kind of explain the era of when Plutarch existed, and why is this critical? Why understanding this time period is critical to the question for which we'll be addressing today?
Absolutely, and I think the main thing that I'd like people to take away in terms of my approach to this period and the approach of mm, a lot of scholars, I mean most scholars to this period, um, is that we're in a period. So this is during the Roman Empire, right? The second half of the first century CE and let's say the first half of the second century CE. And my the work that I've done has been on authors from Plutarch's time to the kind of next generation and a couple of generations after, going into the early third century. And some of those authors we'll see in when we talk about the passage in Plutarch, some of those authors actually are using the same sources as Plutarch here. So that's why that's relevant as well. And there, the work of these authors is highly informed by philology and the study of words and the study of literature. And even their philosophical ideas and even their medical ideas are very much affected by the use of sources of literature from an earlier period. Sometimes, up to let's say, we're talking about stuff that for them was ancient literature, stuff coming from the 4th century BC, the 3rd century BC, 2nd century, right? 5th century, obviously. And obviously Homer, which is earlier, was central to this, right? And the idea is that all of these authors were kind of playing a very kind of large literary game where it was all about what sources you found, who you could quote, where, digging up those sources and kind of like playing with those sources in your own writing was I'll call it parlor game of the day. But it wasn't just a parlor game for them, it was intellectual life. That's how they approached their whole intellectual life. And so in a sense, we have to kind of put ourselves into that historical period of literary production, which Plutarch is part of, which doesn't seek a single scientific answer for any question. It seeks a multiplicity, a diversity, a variety, and that idea of variety was central to the literary thinking of the time. It seeks multiplicity of answers, and it is in the creation of those multiple voices that the kind of intellectual production that they're doing happens. So in a sense, it's like, so for example, in when I was talking about my life and I was talking about this passage in Plutarch about the letter E, as in what we call epsilon today, which was pronounced A, and usually sometimes spelled epsilon iota, so like an E and an I in Greek of that time. So it's called, that was what the letter was called. That letter, Plutarch does a kind of dialogue, which has its origins, obviously, as many listeners will know, in Plato's work. And Plato is a very, very important figure to Plutarch and to a lot of these authors, because not only is Plato a master stylist to authors, like the pinnacle of style, but also for some of them, like Plutarch, the philosophy of Plato is very important. And for a lot of others, it's important to reject the philosophy of Plato in preference for other literary thinking about our lives and world, right? Like the thinking that comes out of Homer or other, what we would call literary authors. Although Plato was a master stylist in the literary sense and regarded such in antiquity. And, still today, those of us who study ancient Greek literature. So Plutarch writes a little bit of a dialogue where 5 different explanations for why that letter E appears in the temple in Delphi happen. And I think this is really important to think about in terms of our conversation today, because Plutarch is a priest of Delphi. He's from an elite family in the area, a few miles. I think he was born a few miles away. And if anybody's been out there, been to Delphi, beautiful mountainous kind of spot, a ski resort today in that area. It's great for wintertime activities and summer activities. They do a little tourism ad for Delphi, but the thing is he's a priest of Delphi, and he's not trying to say this is the answer to the right. He's still giving 5 possibilities for the answer, and in fact, none of them are in line with what the kind of science, I'll call it scientific in our modern sense of scientific study of this, the presence of this letter tells us. That there have been a handful of articles written in the 20th and 21st century about what they think that the E at Delphi really stood, what that letter being in the temple meant, and based on archaeological, historical, and linguistic studies, right? So I think it's really important to understand that Plutarch is thinking about these things in a different way, with a different approach that resembles this literary kind of play, I'll call it, rather than the kind of, I'm going to put rigorous in quotes, but let's say rigorous scientific approach that today we would regard in terms of like linguistic pursuits that we're doing. So that's important to remember, because he's not trying to produce a scientific linguistic fact here, if that makes sense. I'll stop there, so I don't go on too long.
No problem. Yes, well, I guess we can just kind of get into it. And so, for the audience, to better explain the controversy here, as you know, I have been trying to figure out the source of the origin of who associated the word Kemet in the ancient Egyptian language with the word Kim, black, in the ancient Egyptian language. It would seem as a kind of an easy correlation, but in linguistics, we just can't go with our first mind. We have to, go through a process to eliminate other hypotheses to come down to a more plausible conclusion. So there are other homographs in the ancient Egyptian language, because we have to remember that there are no vowels written in the pre-Coptic hieroglyphic script. So all we have are the consonants, and there are other KM consonant roots in the ancient Egyptian language. So my question was, well, how did they choose black versus all of the other homographs in the language? And so doing that study, of course, I came across Plutarch's rendition of, Plutarch's conversation of Isis and Osiris, or on Isis and Osiris text. And this is one of the texts that many of the Egyptologists and other researchers have used to make the correlation between the word Kemet and the word Kim, meaning black, to say that Kemet means the black land instead of some other type of land. And so in the text, Plutarch mentions the word Egypt, which he uses the Bohairic pronunciation, Chemia. And there is a passage in there where he correlates, the soils of Egypt to the pupil of the eye. And many people believe that the that what he's saying is that the name of Egypt matches the name for the pupil of the eye in the Egyptian language. And but what I've come to find out that there is no such word in the Egyptian language. So how could Plutarch have made a correlation between Kemia and a word that sounds similar or the same for the word for pupil? So this is what prompted me, not finding it in the actual ancient Egyptian literature, prompted me to find it, to reevaluate the conversation in Plutarch's text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share, well, not the Chrome tab. Let's go. Nope, that's StreamYard. Let's go. I thought I gave an option. Well, it's not giving me the option to just share my my Adobe Acrobat. So I'm just going to have to show the entire screen. So, and I do apologize for people if I'm looking all squinty-eyed at my screen. That is because I am MacGyver today. I have hooked my PC up to my cell phone because I broke my screen. So we're going to make some things happen. So I'm going to just make this full screen for the audience, and so they can see it better. And hopefully you can see it on your screen.
I can.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the passage in question here. So what I did in the text is I tried to do a partial transliteration of the relevant part of the passage. It's section 33 of this text. And I gave a common interpretation or a translation of this text, which I'll read here. And so he says, Egypt, moreover, which has the blackest of soils, they call by the same name as the black portion of the eye, Chemia, and compare it to a heart, for it is warm and moist, and is enclosed by the southern portions of the inhabited world, and adjoins them like the heart of a man's left side. So at the top here, you can see the original Greek, and we can probably go word for word a little later. I'll let him decide. But I came to a different conclusion based on this. So this particular translation comes from Gregorius in Bernardakis, if I'm saying that correctly, published in 1889. And you can go online and see that currently at well, I didn't put it in this segment, but I put a link in the text where you can find this online, where I found it. But anyway, so if you can give your thoughts on this right now.
Excellent. Yeah. Since we have the passage up, just to point out a couple of things. Let me start with the tomelan. That means the black, right? There's something very interesting about the anatomical structure of the eye that is different about the way that the ancient Greeks talked about it than from the way that we talk about it. So the word, and this is something that where like the translation is a little, Bernardakis's translation is a little of the actual word pupil itself is a little bit I guess Bernardakis doesn't say pupil in the translation. I guess it's the black portion. So the thing about this is that Bernardakis knows that the word in ancient Greek for pupil is kore, which is a different word. The word melon, and we have this going back to kind of Aristotelian texts, which try to differentiate parts of the eye. Tomelon is translated as the iris. So that's the color part of the eye around the pupil. That's what is tomelon in Aristotle. And in Greek, it's usually one or the other is used. I don't think that the differentiation in terms of like strictly like we do differentiating like the aperture of the iris, meaning the pupil, and the color part of the eye as opposed to the white of the eye being we strictly differentiate those, right? We call it iris and pupil. The Greek calls it the black part of the eye and I'll call it the pupil, which is also is the word for girl and a doll, and it's kore. So does that make a big difference in terms of? I don't know. I don't think it really changes anything for us in terms of I mean, the way the Greeks talk about it is as the black part of the eye, and they, I'm imagining that they're regular. I mean, I have blue eyes, right? So I don't think of my iris as being the black part of my eye. But if you have dark eyes, then or if dark eyes are dominant, which I suppose they were, that you're saying that's the dark part of your eye, right? That's the black of your eye. And then the specific kore part, which is the opening, the aperture, we call it pupil. They call by a different word. And I think if we look at that other text, if we could get to that other text I wanted to mention, then I think we'll see that the word kore is used in that text. So this is a text from centuries after Plutarch that purports to be an Egyptian priest's account of what hieroglyphic vocabulary. Now, all of you out there know that this text is not very reliable. It shows, and the reason it's not very reliable is because it's basically working with the same sources as Plutarch, probably for the most part, from probably earlier than Plutarch, but also not in the Greek sources that are kind of trying to make sense of Egyptian hieroglyphs, not really truly helpful bilingual sources here. I mean, some of the words are right. We know that from looking at Barofalo, but most of the words are not right. The explanations are kind of crazy. Like the section on how they write Egypt, right? That's the section on the right hand side of it. Well, on my right hand side, I don't know if on the screen if it's reversed, but that section it doesn't really, and you, all you experts out there, and sorry, you experts here, will understand that, like, wow, this is a little bit of a whack version of explaining what a name for Egypt is. It's a little off, right? This kind of tells you, like, this text is, you know that it's not that reliable. If you go look on the left-hand side of the page, you'll see that it says
on the left page or the left-hand side of the.
You got it right in that spot down there. I'll read it out loud. The country.
I see it.
Yeah, but the country of the Egyptians alone, inasmuch as it is situated in the middle of the inhabitable world, like that part of the eye which is called the pupil, right, of itself causes the rising of the Nile in summer. All right. So here in the Greek, on the left-hand side, the word that is used on the line, it's the third from the bottom, is kore, because that's the Greek word for the aperture of your eye that is
1, 2, 3.
that central opening is called the pupil. Yeah, it was called in English. It's called the kore, ancient Greek. So I will tell you that sometimes the word melon from our previous passage is used by Galen, for example, the medical doctor, to describe the cornea. So for us, the cornea obviously is a clear thing, but Galen, I mean, unlike the Egyptians, the Greeks weren't as awesome at like really anatomical stuff the way the Egyptians are awesome at it. Probably because the Greeks were a little bit squeamish about like the kind of dissection that would be involved in many practices, but and it's also just not part of the technique. So like this kind of confusion happens where you're going to call the whole thing, your iris and pupil together, and the clear thing over top of it, tomelon, the black part of your eye, the black of the eye, dark part of your eye, right? So like the fact that Galen does that shows us that like what we're dealing with here is not the same kind of distinction that we use in English, coming from a very anatomical and scientific distinction, and so that's important to know. Now, so to start off, we'll know that'll give you a sense of what Plutarch is imagining when he says tomelon, something like the color part of our eye, including its central aperture and the cornea, and excluding the white, probably the white of the eye. So that's kind of the distinction here. And so that's number one. The part about the black soil, which I think is a key thing here as well, melangeon, as it is here in Greek, or probably in Plutarch's time, something maybe like melangion. So this word melangeon, or perhaps at this point it's being pronounced melangion, and I'll talk about that pronunciation a little bit later, we first see it in regard to Egypt in Plutarch. Plutarch speaks a different dialect of Greek. Plutarch, excuse me, in Herodotus, and Herodotus speaks a different dialect of Greek, and so it's written differently, and it's written melangeon, gaion, excuse me, melangeon, with which is closer to that. What we know in English like Gaia, and Earth and things like that. So it's closer in sound to that. So what it's saying here is that the entois malista before it means something like, as I would translate it as blank as any, and the blank gets filled in by the what we're describing here, and what we're describing is the blackness of the land. So I would probably translate that as something like, because Egypt, and I'll tell you why I say because Egypt, because Egypt, has land as black as any, right? Just like the black part of the eye, they call it Kemet. Now, the reason I'm saying because is because that usan there, that's a participle, and participles create clauses that can be causal. Especially in this situation, I'd read this as a causal clause, and that's why I start with because. I'd say and furthermore, because Egypt has land or soil as black as any. They call it Kemet. So I think when we start to look at that clause with the melon in terms of just like the black of the eye, the black part of the eye, I think saying, and when this is what kind of a little bit what we talked about when as you mentioned in the beginning of the show, I think when to translate it that the word Kemet means the black part of the eye in Egyptian is a kind of over translation. I wouldn't translate it that way because it's making assumptions which are not present in the text. That in fact it's trying to, that translation is trying to reason out the logic of Plutarch and come up with a sensible reason for why he would be talking about the melon being the black part of the eye in this point. And it's the translator saying, in this case, Bernadakis, saying, oh, that's because that's what Kemet means in the Egyptian language. And so that's why Plutarch is talking about this. But to me, that's over translation. We can't really say that. And to think that Plutarch is saying these things because there's like some sort of really logical explanation for why he's saying that is a red herring. It's a little bit of a problem, because the logical idea here is not what Plutarch is after. And this is why I mentioned earlier on in the show that in this time period, you're looking to come up with multiple explanations for things. And when there's no explanation for things, you're leaving things open to kind of almost a literary poetic interpretation in a certain way. So or philosophical interpretation or mystical interpretation. And this really plays into that Hor Apollo text, because you see that in that text, we're talking about Egypt being the pupil, the pupil, like the pupil of the eye, right? Because it's at the center of the inhabitable world. And they're talking about it as pupil, Kore. And then in the next passage, what do we have? We have a mention of the heart. And what do we have in Plutarch's passage? A mention of the heart, as you translated Asar, is enclosed by the southern portions of the inhabited world and adjoins them, like the heart in a man's left side, right? So we're talking about where the human heart is. So and we're talking about the fact that human beings have the heart on the left side. The southern portions are equivalent to this. It's that's why we call it the heart. So it's a slightly different take on what we see later on in the Hor Apollo text, which means that I don't think that Hor Apollo text is getting anything from Plutarch. It's getting something in this description where there's talk of the pupil of the eye and there's talk of the heart about it in the naming of Egypt, right? And the fertility of Egypt. I'm going to talk about this too, because this is why black is important for the Greek text, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But both Plutarch and the Horapollo text have the same kind of interesting configuration of oh, I have the automatic, yay. I have the automatic do you know this now that Zoom is doing automatic symbols for stuff? So I have that turned on. That's why the balloons happen. So we can celebrate. We can when you put two hands up, it makes balloons appear. So we can celebrate that. I think when you do two thumbs, it does fireworks show. So anyway, I'll try not to do something to distract the audience. But anyway, we can celebrate the fact that we find that both of these texts have the same source or sources. I think it's one source, because this like following up with the black of the eye or the pupil with the talk of Egypt is the heart. It's, they compare it to the heart. That to me, like, all bells go off, and I say, okay, these two texts are pulling from the same text, where there's talk of the pupil of the eye or the black part of the eye and Egypt and the heart and the name of Egypt. So like something's going on here, right? And that, do we have that text? No. Is that text going to be a Greek text and not an Egyptian text? Yes. It's absolutely, I would bet anything on the fact that text is going to be maybe a third, second, first century BC, maybe first century, maybe early first century AD even, compilation of a history about Egypt, or a thing about Egyptian words. It might be a thing on Egyptian words. And that text is going to talk about it. Is it going to talk about it with any authority that we should be concerned with for our interest in like what Egyptians thought about Kemet and what that name of Egypt meant to Egyptians? No, we should not. But for Greeks, this was obviously something that they were trying to present. Obviously, they know about a word that obviously is related to Kemet and that way of referring to Egypt. But the source is too muddled, because it's basically like, if I were to start talking about like what I thought about Egyptian origins of Kemet, that's as good as what Plutarch is doing, right? Because Plutarch's just kind of grabbing something from a text that is a text probably written by a Greek speaker, may have been a Greek Egyptian, may have been someone in one of the places in Egypt where there was a large Greek population, and like I think in Naucratis or Alexandria, obviously places like that, where where Greek is being spoken and used by a particular group of intellectuals for their purposes, and it's probably coming from something like that.
I have on the screen here a section of my text right before the conversation where I showed the Greek text. But the idea that Kemet is looked at as an eye is not far-fetched.
Okay.
At all. And here's just one text. We can go as early as the coffin text, where Kemet is referenced as an eye. Okay. And so what I talk about in the text is that the pupil of the eye for Egypt is the Nile River itself.
That's right. That sounds
right. And so this corresponds to the ultimate meaning of the word Kemet, for which I propose in the text, is that the word Kemet comes from a root meaning to fill, to overflow, to inundate. And and when they're referencing the river itself, and so here's a text.
Yeah.
It is coming from uh hold on. Du- 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 du. The author is Luca Maitello, if I'm saying that correctly. And he has an article titled "On Egypt as the Horus Eye," and he talks and he states the following. He says, as previously interpreted, the Edfu text shows a model in which Egypt, parallel to the iris of the Horus yet, is made whole by the Nile flood. The total area of Egypt as fertile land with waters is 27 million setet.
Mhm.
It's a measurement in Egyptian, and the
Okay.
sum of its components is 26 million setet. The missing value of 1 million setet corresponds
Mhm.
to the enlargement of the Nile waters within the riverbed during the inundation. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if you've ever seen um, like a symbol of the Eye of Horus and it's broken up into fractions, have you ever
In
seen?
fractions? No, I've just seen the whole thing. Yeah, not the
Yeah.
parts. Yeah.
So the Horus eyes is associated with each part of the eye that we saw in, for example, let's go back to it. So when we look at this Harapalo, so he's not wrong when you see this as a representation of Egypt itself, because
Mhm.
that's a valid uh,
Mhm.
hieroglyph for Egypt,
Yeah.
but it's the Wujat eye, right? So each portion of this is associated with a fraction. So this is what his particular text is focusing on,
Okay.
is what is the fractions mean. So there's a missing part that would make it um a complete whole, a complete one.
Mhm. Mhm.
All right. And so what he's saying is that that missing fraction fills up, it becomes whole. The eye of Horus becomes whole
Mhm.
once the Nile River floods. So what they're correlating here
Mm.
is it's like the pupil of the eye dilating. So when there's presence of light or absence of light,
Mhm.
the size of the pupil moves.
Mhm.
So when the iris, excuse me, when the pupils dilate and get big,
Mhm.
is as if it is filling out the eye when your iris gets big. So
Mm.
they're equating
Interesting.
that
Mhm.
to to Egypt itself. So let me continue.
Yeah, yeah.
So it is the annual Nile flood that fills the eye, as indicated in the text. Such a concept was at the basis of the ritual of the filling of the eye. A quantity of water in a cup magically healed and made whole the Wujat eye and Egypt.
Okay.
So this is the primary text coming
Yeah.
from Edfu,
Okay.
where we see the hieroglyphs,
Okay.
and we have
I have a
the
translation.
the transliteration and
Okay.
certain parts in the translation. So this is uh, the part here that associates Kemet with
Okay, the
the
Eye of
eye, but it says
Horus.
since Kemet
Okay.
is called the eye of, in this instance, because the eye, it could be the eye of Horus, it could be the eye of Ra, or it could be the eye of Osiris.
Okay.
So in this instance, it's Osiris.
Osiris. Okay.
So since Kemet is called the eye of Osiris, and the word for eye is Ir,
Uh-huh.
and with Sir here is Osir, and this is the word Kemet here dealing with the country, um, is the eye of Osiris. Its iris is the Nile.
Mhm.
Jafed S. Pu
Okay.
Iteru. Iteru is the word for the Nile.
Mhm.
And so the word for iris in Egyptian is Jafed right here.
Cool.
So in this third person suffix here, its iris
Okay.
is Iteru.
Okay. So
So
then
what
that
it's
word,
telling you. So
yeah, so that word melon, that's what if there were a bilingual speaker of Greek and Egyptian in
uh,
this period, that the Edfu temple, I think, is
it's Greek, yeah.
really right. The period of the Edfu temple is Roman period. The one
Greco-Roman,
the
yeah,
this
but it's
description.
it's def it's definitely like
Yeah.
uh
If there's a bilingual speaker of Egyptian and Greek, they would probably, I'm guessing, and they're like, kind of Plutarch thinking about stuff. They would
Yeah.
that iris part. They would probably call it tomelon. That's what they would probably call the
Yeah.
iris. I'm guessing. Yeah.
So the
anyway.
Western Mountains. So peep the overall metaphors it's using here. So since Kemet is called the Eye of Osiris, the iris is the Nile. The Western Mountains and the Eastern Mountains are its eyeball. All temples of Upper and Lower Egypt are the components of its interior. The Nile flood comes from its twin caverns on its time to inundate the fields, to fill the eye of Horus with its valuable things. So this is a primary Egyptian text.
Yes, right.
that
This is
saying
the
this.
thing to look at for sure.
Indeed. So it's telling us here what is actually being said. It's not equating a word for pupil,
Right.
and the word Kemet itself. It is saying that the Nile River is the pupil,
right.
and essentially when it inundates, it fills out the eye of Horus, which is equated to Egypt itself.
Excellent. Okay.
And so Capo Chichi, who was trying to use this in a different context, this phrase here, didn't read out the whole thing, and so this lets me know that what is being associated here in terms of the filling and the inundation, and the relationship is the inundation itself. And so again, when we go back into the actual Greek of the Plutarch, here there from my reading, there is no Plutarch saying that the word Chemia for Egypt is the same word as the word for pupil in the ancient Egyptian language. I can't get that reading during a transliteration of this particular text, which is what I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. All I was going to say is like the way to get to that is I would just call it an over translation.
Yeah.
Plutarch might be saying that because Plutarch might be implying that the reason that he's talking about the black soil and the black and the pupil of the eye is because, or not pupil, sorry, but the iris. It is because it is that's the deal with like why it's called Chemia. But you have to make an interpretive leap in order to get there, which is I think an over translation because of the way that these sources work. Things get very garbled, and so whatever the original source, which is absolutely a Greek source, since Plutarch was not able to read at Egyptian, right? So like he's getting it from a Greek source. The Greek source is clearly aware of the of Egyptian stuff. Like there's an awareness, and so there may be mystical speculations, as you see in you just showed in the Edfu, the kind of a religio-philosophical mystical speculations that happen in these cases that aren't related to what's the word I'm looking for? Linguistics, right? Or original kind of concepts, but rather those mystical interpretations. And getting to that, I think there's a chance there is a chance that in that text there was something about the word for pupil is the same as the Kemet. There's a chance, I mean, in that Greek text, but I just want to call attention to the fact that we're talking about like basically a third-hand account here of a text, and the same thing with the Horopala, which is probably second-hand account, third-hand account of a text that's talking about this. So it really doesn't, what you're saying is totally, I would prefer what you're saying about it, because I wouldn't want to like make the interpretive leap that maybe others make including Bernardakis and other translators of this, to say that like, well, I have to make some logical sense out of this. It must be that the word for Kimia somehow relates to this pupil of the eye thing, and that leap is just maybe just a leap too far, I think, for the kind of way that Plutarch writes and the way that it's going to do. I was about to cause it to do fireworks. The way that Plutarch writes, and the way that it's a game of telephone. You're reading the source and copying it out, but you make mistakes when you do this. This isn't one of these things where you're passing down an oral text and each successive generation is memorizing it in meter, in rhythm, so that the oral text gets passed down in a way that like has very little variation or change. This is the kind of thing where people are like, writing something out in a book, misquoting, getting things slightly different, and also having different takes on it. And for Plutarch's text, he has different reasons for talking about this passage than Horapollo does in Horapollo's text. So like understanding that historical context, it's kind of like, okay. And that means that like trying to get back to an originary idea of what Kemet might mean, it's kind of like not the place to look. Just because it's going to align, and I think you're showing in your book how it aligns with really contemporary things going on in Egypt, where like there are there's talk of the and I would love to say, and that's not a coincidence to me, because I feel like if getting things out of this like you do, where it's like what happens in the historical period in Egypt in this time, and if Edfu is in fact from the same period as Plutarch, which it may be, I don't know. I've been to Edfu, but I don't know anything. I'm not an Egyptologist, and I don't even play one on TV. So I know nothing about when Edfu is built. But if this text from Edfu is from like pretty much the same time period of Plutarch or Plutarch and Horapollo's sources, then it makes sense to me that there's this like kind of like when we talk about Egypt, we end up talking about the pupil, which for Greeks is totally in the Greek interpretation. What you're saying makes total sense to me, because the reason that the pupil is black, and the reason that that central part of the eye with the iris is black for Greeks is because it's wet. And things that are wet, and Plutarch talks about this in a previous passage, about a paragraph or two before this, that your hair turns white when you're older because you become drier when you're older. And so your hair goes from, if you have black hair or dark hair, it goes from being dark to being gray and whiter when you're older because of moisture. And so the moisture thing, like you're saying, and like you're talking about it, I'm sure you talk a lot about it, in the Greek as well, that is in line with Greek humor theory, the humors. And it's in line with clearly some, Egyptian connection to the Nile and moisture, obviously there, and this pupil thing. So there's something, I feel like there's some resonance going on there in this period, especially. I don't know earlier periods, maybe it's different in earlier periods, but for this period, I think that like that whole thing about moisture is, and that's why Egypt has black land in the Greek view, because it's wet, and wet land is black, right? Because the Nile Valley has rich black soil that has moisture in it, not like the desert parts, which don't have moisture in them and therefore don't have black soil. And I don't know, I guess they knew of the existence of some like volcanic sands, but they probably weren't thinking about that when they were thinking about blackness and sand. But nonetheless,
just to reinforce what you were saying, because this discussion I broke up into two. So I wanted to address the Camilla thing in the introduction, but in chapter 3 is where I bring up the more fuller passage. So I have it all in Greek here, and then I have a translation which talks about this at the beginning. So Plutarch says, let this then be stated incidentally as a matter of record that is common knowledge, but the wiser of the priests call not only the Nile Osiris and the sea Typhon, but they simply give the name Osiris to the whole source and faculty creative of moisture, believing this to be the cause of generation and substance of life producing seed. And the name of Typhon they give to all that is dry, fiery, and arid, in general and antagonistic to moisture. Therefore, because they believe that he was personally of a reddish sallow color, they are not eager to meet men of such complexion, nor do they like to associate with them.
Okay.
Osiris, on the other hand, according to their legendary tradition, talking about the Egyptians, was dark.
That's it.
Because water darkens everything, earth, clothes, clouds, and clouds, when it comes in contact with them. In young people, the presence of moisture renders their hair black.
And it might be
grayness, like a paleness. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile to mention that the word that that Plutarch is using here to describe Osiris is black, like the iris of the eye. That's the same word here when he says the Bernadakis translates it as dark, but the Greek, as I recall from looking at it yesterday, I think it says that it uses the same word melas, black.
It may. I have it here. So here's melon.
Melon. Yeah, has black skin, right?
Yeah,
that's the croon part is skin. It's just the accusative of the word for skin. So melancroon is melancroon means black skin. Osiris is black skin, right?
Is that right here? I think this is it.
Yep. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I immediately went to
it. Sorry.
But I realized for the
it takes me a little bit.
Sorry.
I can read the letters, but
it
takes me a while to find.
Yeah. So that's that mela part. That's the same thing as tomelon. That's melas, the Greek word that is black. And so, yeah. And this is the thing, and that's why the pupil of the eye and the eye is so is black for Greek medical thinkers, is because it is wet and it's like water, and therefore it's like this like very deep abyss, which
indeed
is interesting. And I'll tell you, this is kind of like, there's a little bit of an interesting thing that I've been thinking about, which may help out our thinking about all of this, is about the word. Well, it would have been pronounced probably something like Hemia in Egypt at that time if this word was said by an Egyptian Greek speaker, because that eta is probably an E sound at this point. However, the chi part, which is now he in modern Greek and became that over time, is in some places still being pronounced like an aspirated K. So I totally wouldn't rule out that like this isn't the kind of what a person who's a Greek speaker hears when they hear this word being spoken at the time, for the word Kemet, or however you say it at the time in Egyptian, because the k, an aspirated K rather than the fricative part, would probably be how you pronounce it, both in Egypt and probably in the way that Plutarch may have spoken as well, because of some kind of bureaucratic Greek speaking going on among elites. The pronunciation may have also not been a he, may have been more of a k. But I can't say for sure. There's a really good book about the pronunciation of Greek over time by Jeffrey Horrocks out there. If anybody out there is interested, it's a Horrocks. You check it out. But it's a really excellent book about the historical changes in the Greek sounds of Greek letters and vowels. So, but that word to a Greek ear, it sounds like a word that means a clam, like a bivalve, like the thing you eat. A cockle sometimes is what people call it, because cockles are different from clams, but it's not worth going into right now. But just we'll say clam for the lack of a better word. But the word for like a various shellfish that are some are black, some are light, and authors of the next two generation and a half later, or 2 generations later, authors would talk about how the Kemet, which is spelled like what this would sound like to a Greek, is both comes in black and light varieties, right? Because I think they were thinking of things like mussels and stuff like that, or similar shellfish that have black shells, because they were using it as more of a generic term, not a very specific term for taxonomical term. And that word comes from the word to open, to yawn or gape. The word is casco. The verb means I yawn or gape, and it means it's what the shell does, right? So I found that I kind of got caught up in my own Plutarchian reveries here when it came to that, because I thought, oh, that's interesting, because the aperture of the eye is also kind of it's the thought of this thing as an abyss in Greek medical thinking, where this is watery abyss, and you have this like yawning or gaping word. So that's why I think, like, when you were asking, like, is Plutarch likening it to the word for eye, I think that, like, more likely Plutarch may have something in mind here that's related to some of the words that are spelled the same way in Greek, because they like playing around with these sounds. And Plutarch in this text is always doing kind of like silly things like, Osiris is ultimately a Greek word, right? Because he's trying to talk about all of this stuff in a as I was saying earlier, in this context of Plato and Greek literature. And there's a great article written by Danny Richter in 2001 about how Plutarch tries to just basically appropriate everything in Egypt for a Greek point of view, right? And a Platonic point of view. And so I'm thinking that for Plutarch's thinking, the Kemet part, he's probably hearing this word for a gaping or a clam. It's also a measure, like a small measure, in terms of like a measure of liquid or whatever. He's probably hearing stuff like that. And if he's hearing anything, if it's not just like I'm seeing these words in this Egyptian text about written in Greek about Egyptian stuff that he's pulling from, and I really suspect that's the same text that Apollo is drawing from. If he's not just like garbling things, and the text itself is probably already garbled that he's looking at. So, and even if it's not, it doesn't really. There's no necessary connection between the two. We tend to give authors sometimes too little credit, but sometimes too much credit. And I think in this case, if we try to link this too closely to like some sort of like text that he's reading, where they're talking about the pupil is the reason for Kemet, is the black part of the eye, I think we're giving Plutarch we're overreading it. We're giving him a little too much. Because being on point for what he's doing in this text,
Indeed. And it's just certain kind of background information that the reader would just have to know about ancient Egyptian language and culture. So at this time, they would have been speaking the Coptic language, but there is no word Khmia meaning pupil or even black.
Right.
in the Coptic language for him to even reference,
Okay.
and that was the biggest clue to me, because you um, as mentioned earlier, when we read the earlier parts of the text, he is referencing all kinds of things that are associated with blackness in
Yep.
the ancient Egyptian
Yeah,
culture.
because of
But
the
not once does he use the Egyptian word for black to describe any of those other things,
yes.
right? So that's a clue number one.
Yep.
And then clue number two is that there is no comedian, meaning pupil, in the Coptic or even in the ancient Egyptian language
Right.
for him to confuse and think they were homonyms, that you can interpret it as the Egyptians called the country the same name, because that's what Capo Chichi, states here.
Okay.
So he's quoting somebody. So his interpretation is, in addition, we name Egypt because its lands are black among all, like the black of the eye, Kamia. A direct. So this is how whoever he's citing is interpreting it. And
Right,
from
right.
my
Yeah,
reading,
right.
it's
Which is,
impossible for you to.
I mean,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think what the thing is that it's just a matter of maybe taking one step too far. I don't think these are, if someone were to say that what Plutarch is trying to call attention to here is I think he's trying to call attention to the blackness of the soil, because we're talking about
Mm,
wateriness, and wateriness is blackness, and the soil is, that's what I think he's clearly um, calling attention to here, just like in a reading it, uh, just on the, like you said, on like just on the surface reading it. That's what I think people who are saying then, and this is somehow he's in touch with something about people of the eye. I think they're just kind of um they're just like one step too far. I don't think it's not like a mistranslation. It's just like
mhm,
it's like a making a logical leap, which is possible. It's possible that Plutarch somehow thought that the pupil was also the same word. I mean, it's totally
mm,
possible. It's just that there's no the idea that this is somehow he's claiming that outright. No, and even if he did claim it outright,
mhm,
the odds of that being in line with whatever the Egyptian actually was are negligible. So that's, I don't want to be too like, I don't want to put too fine a spin on it, but like it's a little bit of an
mhm.
overreading of it, you know.
Now
I feel
this
like the
is.
heart. Yeah, I feel like um, there's a similar construction in the Greek with the heart
Mhm,
thing. And this is why I'm pretty sure what I'm saying and what you're saying about like, oh no, we shouldn't think of this as he's like just basically talking about this as clearly as like the pupil is Camilla or whatever, is that when he talks about the heart later, the construction is very similar.
mm,
And the way that he uses that, it wouldn't grammatically lead to us to think that he's trying to say that they call it um, uh, the heart in the way that they call it the pupil. You know what I mean? Like there's a parallel construction there with the heart thing, which
mm,
clearly I think from that Horapollo text they're talking about whatever Horapollo is getting that information from. They're reading something that's equating Egypt to the heart in some way. There's some of the hieroglyphs that may be related to Egypt to the heart, but also
mhm,
nebulous, at least in my reading of the Greek. And so it's kind of like this heart part, you could equally say like their word for Egypt is the same as the word for heart or whatever. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
it's the same structure. So it's kind of like, to me, I think there's a text that's talking about the wetness of Egypt and its centrality to the inhabitable earth, like in the Horapollo text,
mhm,
or it's flooding, like like you were talking about with that Edfu text. There's some text that's talking about that and then talking about the heart and equating Egypt to the heart because of its centrality. And these are like very like priestly texts, no doubt, very religious or mystical or philosophical texts, probably resonating with something in those Egyptian texts, but like to then make that part of like the linguistic, I think that's a kind of leap too far. And then also because the historical period bears out for all of this stuff, talking about it historically, we could say, oh, well, there's something going on here, both in Egypt with the talking about Egypt as the Eye of Horus or Eye of Osiris, and something that is a Greek language Egyptian source to do with Egypt that Plutarch and Harapalo are reading. There's something going on at the same time where all of this conversation is like really relevant, right, to what people are thinking, how they're talking, and to their idea of historical linguistics. But for our idea, we're about 3,700, 600 years too late to like bear upon the actual like what the root comes from, right? You know what I mean? Like the work that you do in historical, because we're about 3,700 years too late at this point in what we're talking about to come up with any plausible Egyptian view. Because even priests in Egypt at this time, it's not like they would necessarily, even if we had something like we do in Edfu, just because it says, this is looked at as the pupil at this point, or the Nile was the pupil or the iris, like you're saying, doesn't mean that was the case in
the Old Kingdom.
The Old Kingdom, right? Exactly. In fact, it's very unlikely to be the case, because I would say the same thing for Greek. The way that they read Homer in this period is very different in spots from the way that 600, 800 years earlier they would have heard Homer, and so it's like the historical periods of these things make a difference. And so I think that there's clearly something going on, as you show in your book here, and as you're talking about with your colleagues and so forth. I feel like there's definitely something going on here with moisture and eyes, and for sure, both in the Greek and seemingly in the Egyptian too. That might be a larger kind of religio-philosophical current in the world going on at that point, but it seems to be very historical, like very concentrated to this historical period.
Indeed. Well, lastly, I just want to, for those who haven't gotten the book yet, it's on page 46 is where I give my interpretation. And I had this sent out to some other scholars of Greek literature and language to critique it. But I interpret the passage as, moreover, Egypt, which they call Kemia, has the blackest of soils, just like the black of the eye, which they liken to the heart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I interpret it. And, one of the things when I was looking through, like, just an introduction into the Greek language was this, the way that their language in many respects kind of doesn't have a fixed word order. And so, like, they can have an adjective, at the beginning of the sentence, but be describing something at the end of the sentence for which the adjective is associated with.
Sure.
And, I had to keep all of that in mind when doing the analysis. But again, when I look at everything combined, the fact that there is no Kemet pupil in the language at any time period, and the way that the sentence is structured, and within the larger context of that, I was like, this needs a fresh eyes and a reanalysis. And that's what I came up with. So a lot of folks, there was only one who disagreed with me, and I put his commentary in the text for the readers to judge for themselves. but yeah, this is
Yeah.
so it's an ongoing thing, of course, but it just speaks to the fact that, you know, just because something has been looked at one way and people have agreed over time does not necessarily mean that that is the interpretation, and that you can't go back and, you know, review with a more critical eye.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm finding this a lot in Egyptology, where a
Mhm.
lot of old interpretations of concepts and things have gone unchallenged
Yeah.
throughout the years, and it's just been put into a number of textbooks.
Mhm.
And when, you know, I either do a more rigorous comparative analysis in terms of linguistics, or just
Mhm.
a philological analysis, you know, some ideas, uh, in my view, cannot be interpreted in the same way in which has been the standard, without uh, for me, without the African context, because a lot of these words exist still. Like even when we think about the word Kemet, right? There are other African languages with the same homographs and homonyms in the language, and even in Chiluba Bantu, you know,
Mhm.
we have the word Chishima, and Chishima. The T in Kemet, or just the suffix T in the ancient Egyptian
Mhm.
language, is prefixed. That morpheme is prefixed in the Bantu languages as either ki, like if you say Kiswahili,
Uh-huh.
or chi is another way in
Mm.
which it's been palatalized and it's pronounced. So when I say chi or cha shima, that the K is now palatalized to sh, and this is the word for wetness and moisture, and this would be a dialectical, you know, or family
Mhm.
related variant of the word kemet, dealing with moisture and damp ground. Like even to say the word damp ground in Chiluba, you would say kama or chikama,
Mm.
you know, right, for just damp ground or
Okay.
wet land, wet ground or
Mhm.
whatnot. So
Hmm.
it would make sense, you know, within the family construct is how they are describing it in um, the actual ancient Egyptian literature. But you know, there's no text in ancient Egypt that's, because you know they didn't have a profession called linguistics,
Right.
and they didn't have dictionaries that says this word means this and this word means this, right? You got to
Mhm.
kind of have context clues, or you have to
Mhm.
look at, you know, comparative analysis between
Mhm.
related languages.
Yeah.
um but but also, you know, another issue that I brought up in the text about Plutarch is that
Mhm.
when he wants to try to define a word
Mm.
in Egyptian,
Yeah.
he has no problem explicitly doing it, saying that this word means this,
Oh, sure, sure.
and
Yeah.
and this and this, and he'll be wrong. And so the example
Right.
I give,
That's the thing, because the Greeks didn't really have the equivalent of the historical linguistic work
yeah,
that you're talking about. They had kind of like kind of linguistic play as that version. They'll say, and like in terms of etymology, they had no similar etymology or etymological system or approach as we do. It's
yeah,
completely different, and so yeah, everything ends up being pretty whack. But like interesting in a whack way, because they're trying to do kind of mystical philosophizing here, right? So
hmm,
like that's why it's like it has to be whack, right? Because you're doing something mystical, and you're not doing something like, you know, scientific etymology, right? So it has to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more interesting in a certain way, but not interesting if we want to find out like what are the kind of like historical scientific roots of these various things. Yeah.
yeah. This is one example here He says, but it is in section 29 of Plutarch's on Isis Osiris. But it is my opinion that if the name Serapis is Egyptian, it denotes cheerfulness and rejoicing. And I base this opinion on the fact that Egyptians call their festival rejoicing Sere. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct. But you know, the word Serapis comes from two Egyptian words, you know, one being Osiris. That's where the Ser, and then the Apis for the Apis bull.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And but
Clearly.
he knows the that these are separate words, but he doesn't.
Right.
He's trying to make sense of the Ser
Yeah.
part. He knows the Apis for the Apis bull, but he doesn't know the Ser. So he jumps to this word here, Sere, Saare, however you want to pronounce it, and says it's a festival of rejoicing. Well, this isn't an Egyptian word for rejoicing. Not one I can find in Middle or Old Kingdom or even in Coptic.
You know where I look when I see these things? I go to a Greek dictionary and I just go to the LSJ online or whatever and look around for words that, you know, I could think of words that he might be like riffing on in Greek that sound to him like, you know, because when Plutarch and other authors of this period and other periods in Greek say things like, oh, Isis is a Greek word, right? Or, you know, this is, you know, like things like that, right? Which are, you know, just kind of like, well, you're like, why did they do that? And because they're thinking all the time about the Greek language and their words. And so like, and what they feel like sounds like something. And so there's probably, Plutarch probably had in mind a Greek word for rejoicing. Like, you know, let's say the word Cairo, which would be spelled I don't know what the Greek spelling is in his text of this Syre, but to me it sounds like he's trying to say Kyrie, you know, which means, you know, he rejoices or, you know, whatever. And like it was also used to the word for like hello, basically. And I have a feeling that like there are words that in Greek that he's hearing, and then you just like change it a little bit to make it fit the bill, right? So like it has to be about Serapis, so there's a S sound. So instead of Kyrie, it's Syre, and there you go. Ta-da! And that's like, you see that all the time with these Greek etymologies because they're thinking what they know. They don't know any Egyptian. I mean, Plutarch visited Rome, the city of Rome. And from what we know, like from what he said and others, even he didn't speak Latin very well either. So he was really very much a kind of monoglot. He was not a polyglot. He knew Greek. He knew that was his heart language, and that's what he knew. He knew the smattering of Latin, you know. That's clear. He had a hard time with it. So he you know is just doing, he's saying like, this sounds like a Greek word to me, because everything sounds like a Greek word to him because Greek is what he knows. You know, it's like me writing about this, like, oh, Serapis sounds like saran wrap, and you know, it's from the word to enclose because of saran wrap. You know what I mean? Like that's like exactly.
Ironically, I was saying, ironically, we still fight that today when I'm in conversations with laypersons who try to connect concepts and words together because they sound alike, and that's what I focus on in this text, is that there's, in linguistics we call it paronymy, right? And so paronymy is the belief that two or more words that sound similar are connected or derived from the same root. Now, this can be the case, as is often, but what is often the case is that they are not related. But in the ancient mind, words that sound alike there has to be a connection
Yep.
because they're
No matter
looking to
what language they
synthesize.
were
They're
in.
looking for a common. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a
They
human phenomenon.
they
And
didn't have a sense of these like family trees, these kind of phylogenetic pictures of how languages evolve from a proto language, or they just had the
mhm,
idea that all languages must somehow be related, or you know I know Greek, so therefore Greek is like related to everything. And so, yeah, I know
yeah,
it sounds different in Egyptian, but ultimately those words are probably related to Greek words and somehow. Like that's the back of the mind thinking, even if it's not the front of the mind thinking, it's always like these
yeah,
words are related because in my head, I'm going to take a word that sounds like it in Greek and then I'm going to kind of make it slightly what I think is Egyptian, Egyptianizing, and then I'll be like,
yeah,
ta-da,
yeah,
so um, that's totally what's going on there because they don't have scientific linguistics or any version
mhm,
of historical linguistics that we would recognize as like scientifically valid. Right? They had their own sciences and studies that they did and their own concerns. And yeah, for Plutarch, it wasn't that he was getting to the original root in the a proto language for
mhm.
Serapis or whatever, which obviously he wouldn't have even known that. Yeah. I mean, he should have known, right? Because it's a Greek made up like kind of combo or something. Like, but he doesn't.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We kind of went over a little bit. Uh, Actually, 30 some odd minutes over.
Oh,
But
this has gone on and on. Oh, I hope it was
but
beneficial
no,
for everyone.
it truly was. It truly was. And so again, it was an honor. And before we go, just want to uh, let everyone know that you can follow him on YouTube at the following address. And he probably won't necessarily be going through a lot of Greek literature, but I'm pretty sure you'll find its and bits in there uh, that is useful as he stated at the beginning of our program. And so I'm glad I could pull you out of retirement, if that's the right word,
That's
to
it. Yeah,
discuss
that's a good way of
something
putting it.
um, this important time period. So we learn we got to be careful um, when we're reading the ancient literature and they're trying to define words not only externally but even within their own language. And we just got to be more
Right.
critical, of the text and to understand the cultural context and the time period. So I guess, I've been working on this theory of relativity as
Mm.
applied to social science.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
and matter of fact, I have my um, book here, which I've torn the cover off. Um, it's not my book per se, but
Okay.
uh, The Mathematics of Relativity for the Rest of Us. All You Want to Know About Relativity, but Thought You Couldn't Possibly Understand by Dr. Louis Jagerman, S. Jagerman, because I'm on my quantum field theory studies
All right.
now. So, but I think about how everything is relative in terms of physics, but especially, of course, in social science. So you always got to keep in mind time and space time.
Oh,
You know,
yes.
when you're going for these particular ancient texts, and just as you said earlier, trying to take something from the first century A.D. and to interpret it for something in, let's say, 2700 BCE is not going to work
Yeah. Yeah.
most times. So there's a process for which this can be done. But any last words
Well, I just
from
want
you
to
for our audience before we go?
Well, I just want to thank you, Asar, for inviting me on. It's been great. It was a pleasure, absolute pleasure, to be able to, as you say, come out of retirement and think about Plutarch a little bit today. And it's been it was a great pleasure to be able to talk to everyone out there in your audience. I'm so glad you all were listening, and I hope you got something out of it. And blessings to everyone.
Indeed. Well, I don't know what particular shows is coming up just yet, so y'all will just have to subscribe to the channel, and so you can get the notices of our next live sessions, or even pre-recorded videos like this one here. But I want to again thank our guest, Dr. John Paulas, for enlightening us on his favorite period of the Greek literature, or the Greco. Excuse me, I'm still speaking in Egyptology terms instead of Greco, but the Greek literary period, for which is important to this larger discussion on the etymology of the place name Kemet. And I don't expect this to be the end all be all to the conversation. And so, questions, comments, make sure that you leave them below in the comment section, and make sure you visit his YouTube page and subscribe, so we can get before we go, talk about those cards that you made.
Oh, Life's Potluck Buffet. Yeah. It's a deck of 55 cards about everything you do in life. They're 52 numbered cards, 3 wild cards, and each card is a prompt, a real meaty prompt, to have you think about your work, your life, and what you need to do going forward for yourself, from yourself, in conversation with others as well. And so it's Life's Potluck Buffet. And lifespotluck.com is the website right now. And definitely go to the YouTube. Besides, every day I talk about a topic that is out there in the world. And I pull a card from the deck for the cards to answer the question about that topic that I talk about, and go from there. So do definitely tune in and subscribe. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank our guests for coming on. And until next time, we will see you here on the Mbongi. And make sure that you subscribe and you hit the like button, and that you share this conversation with friends and colleagues. Until next time, peace.
Tokyo wanna those that. What's up? Feeling like I dropped the draw for in part uno. Came to kick the door where the game man judo. Pin game low, that's why they give me kudos. Inspired by the 3-0. 595, check it for pack light. Hit the turnpike, slide to a baseline. Gotta sound like I just hit the 8-5. Oh, I'm so ready. By enemies necessary, we gon' be legendary. Hold up. About to grow the payrolls. If you see the vision and you're with it, you should say so. Cause we about building, elevating the millions.